My guest today is Debbie Kimberg, a busy mother of 3 boys, an author, and an executive in the financial services industry. She has spent the past 7 years helping her children and herself recover from autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and other mental health issues caused by stealth infections overlooked by traditional medicine. She also works with multiple Lyme foundations and administers various Facebook groups on Tick-Borne Diseases, PANS, and autism. In today's episode, Debbie and I talk about infections that can enter the brain and cause autism, ADHD, psychiatric symptoms, and autoimmune diseases. Welcome to Lifeology.
Thank you so much for having me, James. Really appreciate it.
I am excited about this. I was reading all this. I'm like, oh, and then this is a really serious topic. So I was like, oh, I'm a little more somber in this, but it's a really good, informative session here or interview here because there's so many aspects of different diseases that kids have or just even adults have that we don't really know what the foundation is. So your information today is really going to give us that information to help people be aware of what might be an underlying cause of some of the struggles or disorders that some of their kids may have.
Yeah, I hope I can share our experience and wisdom after going through this with other families and help them as well.
Yeah. Now, when I was reading your background, I guess, with the 3 boys you had one boy, who I think was your oldest boy, was diagnosed with autism on the spectrum, and he's pretty much told, or you assumed from your doctors, et cetera, that he wouldn't be very functional, if you will. I hate to say that like that way, but not being able to be self or independent. And so you found some information about that, and then wonderful news with him as of today. It's great. But walk us through the aspects of when you realized your kids had these struggles and what the struggle was for you, what you were told, and how you found your way through that.
Yeah, sure. So it's actually my youngest boy.
Oh, your youngest, gotcha. Okay.
Who's 18 now. But yeah, so when he was born, we knew there were some things that weren't quite right, but we didn't get the autism diagnosis right away because he made eye contact and he laughed.
Certainly.
And, he was very affectionate. But as he got into school, he had trouble with ADHD, making friends, just really hyper. He wasn't doing well in school. He was very behind. And so then we got the autism diagnosis, and he had a lot of supports in school, and we didn't realize, you just think your kid is born this way, right? Like some kids have ADHD. Our middle son had ADHD, and so we kind of knew what that was already from our middle son. And then you just go, okay, well, this is our life. Lots of people have kids with ADHD or autism. And when he was 10 years old, we stumbled across a doctor who was an integrative doctor, and she said, a lot of families are testing positive for Lyme disease, and which has a lot of different infections associated with it, which we'll talk about. And I couldn't believe it, but we were positive, and I had almost no symptoms. And so the idea is that not only was my son positive, but I tested positive, and I had almost no symptoms, no idea. I didn't even know anybody who had Lyme disease or even really understand what it was. And then we began a whole journey of treatments, which I'm sure we'll get into because that's really critical.
Yeah. Did your other sons also have Lyme disease? So they test positive for that?
Yes.
Gotcha.
100% transmission.
Gotcha. Okay.
Of every infection, and there were 3. And everybody had it.
Wow. I'm sure a lot of my viewers and listeners hearing this, as a mother, as a parent, your job, if you will, I'm putting this in quotes for people who can't see me, is to protect, to nurture, to help your children thrive. To realize that you unknowingly transmitted this to your children, how was that for you as a mother to experience that?
It was horrifying.
Yeah, I bet.
I was like, oh my God. How come nobody caught it first? Like, why aren't doctors screening for this? And we can also talk about that because I think that's a very important aspect of the story too. And yeah, I mean, it was just so awful to think, oh my God, something that I had that I didn't know actually got my kid sick. Because, I think when we think about kids with autism, we think of the behaviors, right? Like even if you look at the diagnostic criteria that the CDC has, it's all classification of behaviors, of communication, repetitive behaviors, and so on. But then, you start understanding what Lyme disease, and actually what caused most of his symptoms is an infection called Bartonella, which nobody's ever heard of. And it is really the most important infection you've never heard of, because it caused about 70% of his symptoms. But then you start realizing, oh, there's brain inflammation, and that is what is causing the behaviors.
Sure.
It's not that the behaviors are inherent. But the good news is that with proper treatment, you can see a lot of improvement.
Yeah. When you found this out from the doctor and then you started your own journey, there are some physicians and some practices who don't necessarily, I don't say agree with it, but think it's just, it's a short little time of infection and then it's gone. And then you have other people, more integrative individuals and practitioners who really understand and have a different viewpoint of that. When you were working and advocating for your kids, did you find some opposition when it comes to some physicians? They didn't maybe perhaps take it as seriously as others?
All of them. So there's this big dichotomy in understanding of what's going on. And there are a very small amount of doctors, we call them Lyme specialists, because they do this all day, every day. These are the patients that they treat. And they have very different experience compared with what the CDC is explaining to all the doctors, what they have on their website. And so it's causing a lot of issues. And a lot of people blame the doctors and they're gaslighting us and they're not listening. But I think it's deeper than that, because if they're not getting the training and education on, on what's going on, then that's where the issue comes in. And we got to bring everybody together so that, we can all get the right screening and treatments. And one of the fundamental problems that is underlying all this is that the tests don't work. So the LabCorp Quest tests, I think they have about a 20% positivity or accuracy rate. And so think about all the people who aren't testing positive, and it gives this false impression that, hey, Lyme disease and all these other infections associated with it are rare. When in fact, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think this might be a silent epidemic. And a lot of people are going to have to get screened with better quality tests.
If I remember correctly, the CDC version of that test, I don't remember the exact year when it was initially conceptualized or put into practice, but it seems like it's pretty archaic. In other words, it's pretty old, and it doesn't seem as if it's adapted to the research as of today.
Yeah, that is so true. One of the problems, there's a couple problems with the testing that's available today. And one of the problems is that it looks for antibodies. And these infections are some of the smartest infections, I think, known to medicine at this point. And it takes down your immune system. It knows how to hide, how to evade, and the antibodies. And so a lot of times people don't make enough antibodies to be able to screen for it, that the tests just aren't sensitive enough. Also, these infections, they really like the tissue. So we think about a lot of infections living in the blood. But what do you do if you've got infections that are living in your brain or your heart or some other organ, and they're not really circulating in your blood as much, and so you're not even going to find it, even on PCR tests where they actually draw blood and they stain it and they look under a microscope. Even that can be very hard to detect. It's better, but it also can be difficult. So they need to do a lot of work on how to test it.
Of course. What would be your recommendation from your studies as far as if people obviously want to find more information about this and to learn about it? What would be some of the tests that you would recommend for them to have their doctor run on them?
Sure. So there's a couple high quality tests, and they still give false negatives. Like the doctors, the Lyme specialists will tell you it really needs to be a clinical diagnosis. But some better tests are for Bartonella, which causes a lot of symptoms that get diagnosed as autoimmune disease.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had thyroid. That was one of my few symptoms that I had. I had symptoms. I just didn't know they were symptoms because they didn't bother me.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I had thyroid. I had anxiety. Just a couple things. But so Bartonella, the two big testing labs for that are Galaxy Diagnostics and T Labs. They both specialize in Bartonella testing, have the best Bartonella researchers who've developed those tests, best researchers in the country. And then also Vibrant Wellness has a very good comprehensive test, as well as IGeneX. And maybe I can touch on this piece that LymeDisease.org did a study back in 2018, and they had people respond about how many infections tested positive. And on average, 50% of the respondents said they had Lyme plus 2 other infections. So Lyme is caused by the bacteria called Borrelia. And then a third of the respondents said they had 3 additional infections in addition to Lyme. And this is also another reason why the testing is so problematic, because doctors think, oh, this is rare, the testing doesn't work, and nobody's thinking about all the different bacteria, viruses, parasites that ticks and other vectors can carry that that can get transmitted in a single bite, because we just call it Lyme, and sometimes that really bothers me because it can be a lot more than just Lyme.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight. I didn't know that. Obviously, I'm ignorant when it comes to a lot of this, but it's good to know that Lyme disease is simply Lyme disease. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a Bartonella, or the Babesia, or the other aspects of the different infections as well. So it's good to have that demarcation, or that separation for people's awareness as well. Now, when it comes to the tests that they have, if I remember correctly, there's supposed to be like 5 bands in the test, and you have to have a minimum of 3 of the bands in the test. So bands would be the markers in your blood, or whatever test they take. And so you have to have a minimum of 3 markers out of the 5 in order to say that you are, that you actually have Lyme disease. Is that correct?
You're on the right track.
Okay.
I don't know exactly how many markers they test for, but it's probably in the 12 to 15 range.
Wow, a lot more than I thought. Okay.
And they want you to have 5 positive to be considered a positive test. And you can have 1, 2, 3 bands, only just a little bit showing positive, and have a raging infection. And
see, that's it.
Which is why so many people are falling through the cracks.
Yeah, that would make sense, because if they say you have to have a certain number of those bands have to show up, but if you're showing up 1, I mean, that would mean that you would have at least 1 strain of it, wouldn't you? I mean, that's, maybe I'm not understanding correctly how it works, but logically that would make sense to me.
They're saying that if you actually have the infection, then all of these bands would be positive. That would actually indicate an active infection.
That's okay. It makes sense. It's an aspect of it. Okay, it's not the full marker for it. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think it'd probably be good to talk about mild symptoms of Lyme disease and all the related infections.
Sure, let's talk about it.
I don't know about you, but when I heard about Lyme years ago, I only heard about people who were really sick, people who had terrible pain, they were debilitated, they couldn't go to work, chronic fatigue. I think those are the things that you hear about most. And I think it's going to be a lot like COVID, right? Where a certain percentage of people ended up in the hospital on respirators. And some people had cold and flu symptoms for a week or 2. And some people had almost no symptoms at all.
Or asymptomatic,
Yeah. And I think that's where we're going to find this too, that that the people and the way we think about Lyme are like similar to the people who ended up on respirators with COVID. Like those are the very severe cases, and those are the ones that get screened. But there's so many symptoms people don't realize that are associated with these infections that just fly under the radar, and it looks completely different in an adult versus what we're seeing in these congenital situations with our kids. And I definitely want to make sure we leave on a good note about my son's story.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to that. Yeah, it is exciting. When I read it, I was like, that's wonderful. So tell us about that. So when he was younger, what was his symptoms? And then now as he's looking for college, tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I mentioned that he really didn't do well in school. Reading was very hard for him. Just his reading comprehension was very low, which made everything just a challenge for him. And he was hyper and silly, but as he hit the teen years, he became much more kind of angry, just bad mood, a recluse. He didn't come out of his room, want to play electronics all the time. And I'm sure a lot of parents with autistic boys in particular can relate to the kids who just want to lock themselves in their room. But it actually took a long time to be able to find a treatment that works because there just hasn't been enough focus on these set of infections and how to treat them, because it's not just one, right? It's not just like taking an antibiotic for strep throat and it's going to go away in a couple days. That these are long-term chronic infections, and so the treatment is actually very hard. It can take years of antibiotics. Some people take herbals, and we were actually having a very hard time treating him. It's like, okay, gosh, we know what's causing the issues, and he wasn't responding well to any of the treatment. And so it took us a number of years. And by the time we turned the corner, he was 15 and a half.
Wow. Oh, goodness.
And so, yeah, we were 5 years going to different doctors, trying to figure out how to treat it, because it is super hard. And no one doctor today, I think, has all the answers. But then when he turned the corner, all of a sudden we saw this huge reduction in symptoms. And it started with that angry behavior. He started trying to run away, and that was a big issue for us. Obviously a safety issue, and just, he was much happier and talkative and coming out of his room. And it started to associate that with depression was a lot of the reason why he was in his room, but he couldn't articulate it. And he became the most talkative person in the house. And
that's wonderful.
Vocabulary exploded, and we realized how far behind he was in vocabulary. I think he had a lot of brain fog. His picky eating went away. He put on 30 pounds in 6 months.
Oh, wow. And, that's wonderful.
And all of a sudden, he was this, scrawny kid, and then he looked like a healthy, thriving teenager. And then and he had a lot of tics, the face grimace, if you're familiar with that, arm flapping when he was happy, all kinds of things. But what really struck us is when we got to treating the Bartonella, which was a clinical diagnosis, by the way, he tested negative. We didn't even know what was causing all the different symptoms. But his ADHD went away, and his learning disabilities went away within about 4 months of treating him. And so by this point, he was 16, and he was at the end of his sophomore year, and all of a sudden he was doing great in school. And he had a tutor to kind of help him organize and get his work in. And he was saying, no, I don't need this. I'm fine, Mom.
That's awesome.
And his grades went from C's to A's, and he was doing it all by himself. Wow. And so they moved him out of special education in the beginning of 11th grade.
Wow. So he mainstreamed. That's wonderful.
Was a first for his high school. And he still has autism. He's on the spectrum. I don't want to say it's 100% cure, because it wouldn't be accurate. He's just much, much better. I say he's about 80% better, but some of the social oddities are still there for sure.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. I mean, I'm sure as a mother, well, anyone hearing this story, that's so inspiring, but it's also, the aspects of really seeing your son come into himself and to be able to be self-sustaining and be able to launch out into something more than perhaps the struggles fears and worries you had when the previous symptoms that he demonstrated.
Yeah. So much so. Like, we didn't think he'd be able to go to college because he was testing at a fifth grade level for reading comprehension. And
Oh,
so
wow.
we didn't think college was in the cards for him. And I was working on with a lawyer how to get him on disability, and it was going to be in a group home. And that's what we were planning for him.
Yeah.
When he was in ninth grade, the beginning of 10th grade. And then all of a sudden he was doing great in school. And it even showed up on his statewide testing because he went from the 19th percentile on the previous test to the 46th percentile. So right on track for 10th grade. And
that's amazing.
So then we're like, oh my gosh, he said he wanted to go to college. That's his dream. And so, we've been spending the past 2 years helping him with the ACT tutoring, and not us, but we got that for him, and we're so excited. He got into college, and
it's amazing.
He's going in the fall. We're thrilled.
Yes, of course. I'm obviously thrilled for him as well. We only have a couple more minutes here, but transitioning back to individuals or parents who can relate with what you're talking about today, what steps would you suggest that they take to find a provider and also get the correct tests? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so that's such an important discussion to have. So you need to find what's called a Lyme specialist. And so there's a couple different Lyme organization websites that have lists of doctors. So projectlyme.org is a great website that has a list of doctors. You could also look on Global Lyme Alliance. Not all of them treat kids. So you definitely want to make sure. I know Project Lyme for sure has a filter where you can search for pediatrics. So that would be the first step. Finding a great doctor who really understands what this looks like in children and how to treat it is the most important decision you're going to make. And then just be prepared for a very long road of treatment and different medications, because it will take a lot of different medications and herbals, as I mentioned, and will take years. So the earlier you get the kids screened, the better off you're going to be. Not only is it going to hopefully help heal them and get be more mainstream and social throughout their lives, but also waiting till they get older, the kids start wanting to refuse the medications.
That's fair.
And so that can become a real problem. So the earlier, the better you can get them screened.
Perfect. Well, Debbie Kimberg, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on my show today. Thank you so much for your knowledge, your wisdom, and sharing the wonderful things about your kids. If my viewers and listeners want to find out more information about you, to access all the resources that we've been talking about today, where would they find this information online?
Sure. So I have a website, debbiekimberg.com. And if you look under research, I have all my favorite research papers. I give an overview of all of these infections. I also have a section on media and publications. So I've written a number of blogs that are under publications. I encourage everybody to read those. And also, I wrote a memoir, which I am working to publish. I think it's such an important story to tell about what's possible with the right medication, with the right diagnosis and right treatment. And so if you're interested in that, sign up on the mailing list and we'll notify you when it's published.
Wonderful.
Also, I just want to mention I'm on social media. So take a look at TikTok and Instagram and also Facebook under Hijacked Brains, which is also tied into the title of the book.
Wonderful. My viewers and listeners also know that if you can't find this information any other place, simply go to the show notes at jamesmiller@lifeology.com, and I'll link you with Debbie Kimberg, and her website is debbiekimberg.com. Thank you so much for being a great guest today.
Thank you so much, James. Appreciate it.